I'm going to this pawn shop 4 weeks in a row in order to see if you can still find video games at pawn shops. So let's go ahead and head out there and see what I can find. That right there is the pawn shop I'm going to be going to 4 weeks in a row. I'm going to go once a week for the full month to see what I can find in this pawn shop. So let's go ahead and see what I can find for week 1. So I headed into this Cash America pawn for the very first time here in search of some hopefully good stuff. Right off the bat, I saw these MetaQuest 3 and 3S's here. They actually had a ton of them in this glass case, as well as that Atari console, which was way overpriced and definitely not worth it. But I did end up finding Pokemon Sword, or whatever they spelled it, for the Switch, but it was just way too expensive there. And then I made my way to the console wall, which didn't really have anything special there. And then I made my way back to the games. And unfortunately, for the first week of starting this video out for this whole month, we didn't end up finding anything, which is kind of a bummer. But I'm going to leave this in because I feel like, to be completely transparent with you, that's how this stuff goes. You don't always find stuff. A lot of times I go into a place and it just won't have anything, or maybe someone came before me and bought it, or maybe I'm a little too early, but whatever it is, hopefully over the course of the next 3 weeks after this one, we can actually find some good stuff. I'm parked out in front of the Cash America again. Week 2, here we go. Let's see if we can find anything good, because I really hope we can, because week 1 was not so good. So I made my way back into the Cash America pawn shop for the second week in a row here, and I headed straight to where they had the consoles. And honestly, I ended up spotting something that I wasn't quite sure if it was worth picking up yet. So I went ahead and asked them what it came with, and that was this blue 3DS XL. This is not the new version, unfortunately, but it did come with this bag, as well as a few games here back in the back. However, the only game that was of any interest was Mario Kart 7 there, so I continued on to the game section, where I ended up actually spotting a new Nintendo 3DS XL. It was a gray version, but it had looked like it had been like burnt or something, and so for 120, I was like, hey, could you do 100 since the condition? And that is when they ended up selling this to me for $100, which is not a bad deal, because honestly, I kind of checked this out while I was there, and it looks like they just kind of like burnt the first layer of plastic, or like something got stuck to it that was hot. And honestly, I feel like if you got a nice solid case for this, you could slap it in the case and you would never know the difference. Now, I feel like it is a little damaged, which it is what it is, but $100 for a new Nintendo 3DS XL is insane. Even though it does have that damage, I think grabbing this for that price is definitely worth it. The screens are dirty, but nothing is actually wrong with it. I tested everything. I played a game in it. Everything about this worked. So for $100, this was definitely well worth it. I know that burn mark is a little weird, and I think that does detract from the value. But if you were to buy one of these from price charting, or use that for your prices, this would run you about $250 before the damage. So maybe like $175, $200 with this damage. But again, I think slap a case on this and you'd never know the difference. So for $100, this was definitely well worth it, and it came with a charger, so I thought this was worth grabbing. Week 2 ended up being pretty good for us, and I am parked outside of the pawn shop for week 3, so let's head in there and see if we can find anything good. So I headed into the pawn shop for the 3rd week in a row in search of video games, and I wandered directly back to the back because they'd actually changed around a bunch. Now, usually the past 2 weeks there were games in this little shelf, but all their consoles were here, and I didn't see any of their games out at all, which was a little weird. But then I noticed in the console games, there's actually 3 NES games, and I went ahead and grabbed a worker so they could help me out here, and I ended up looking through this. They wanted $15 for every game here, but I wasn't really interested in grabbing all of them, but I did end up talking them down to $10 for this one, which is totally awesome. And that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Now, as you can see, they did have it marked for 15, but I asked if they would take less, and they said they could do 10, which is totally awesome. So I ended up grabbing this game for 10 bucks. I know it is just an NES game, but if you look this up on Price Chart, it's worth around $15, so grabbing this for 10 is definitely well worth it. And honestly, I haven't seen very many cartridge games, or at least old cartridge games, at this pawn shop, so finding some NES games was kind of a shock, and even better that I found one that was actually well worth picking up. Alright, it is the final week that we are heading into the pawn shop. I'm parked actually in front of it, so let's go ahead and run in there and see if we can find anything good here. So for the fourth and final week, I ended up heading into this pawn shop in search of games, and I went down the aisle, kind of weird, but again, they've kind of moved things around. I think last week they were still trying to figure out how they wanted to do this because there were no games available, but there were a bunch of consoles, as you can see here. And I ultimately ended up finding only two things, or kind of one thing, and that ended up being these pastel purple or pink and green Joy-Cons. For 25 bucks, this was definitely well worth it. They had put it out like just recently because these were not there. But I ended up picking up both of these for 25 bucks. They both work, and they have this interesting clear and black case that actually makes the Joy-Cons more comfortable, so that's pretty cool. Now, I know you're probably thinking the Switch 2's out and no one's gonna want to pick these up, but picking up these things for 25 bucks, even though they are used, is pretty awesome because I believe if you buy these brand new, it's like 60 or 70 bucks, so 25 bucks for these were definitely well worth it, and honestly, I'm not too mad about picking these up. So there you have it. I spent a whole month going to the exact same pawn shop 4 weeks in a row, and I actually ended up finding some decent stuff. So the real question is it worth going to pawn shops in search of video games? I think the answer is yes. I mean, I found some, so the answer is yes, but sometimes when you go, they're going to be very packed with things and you'll find some cool stuff like I did. But then you'll see things like the first week that I went where I didn't actually find anything, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's just how it goes. I did find some really good deals. I think obviously the best deal was this Nintendo DS. I know it was burnt, but it is what it is. It's kind of interesting the way that it was burnt and how everything worked, but for as much as I paid for it, which was only 100 bucks, this thing is definitely awesome. Again, like I said earlier in the month, I guess, it's been a while since I recorded that, this is actually just throw a case on it and it'll be good. And then we've got an NES game, which is crazy because I never see NES, Super Nintendo, or Nintendo 64 games there. So seeing this for 10 bucks, well, 15 and talking them to 10, that's definitely worth it. And even finding some Joy-Cons that are not your normal colors. You wouldn't typically find these pastel colors out in the wild. So I definitely think this pawn shop ended up being awesome. But if you want to see me do this again with like Goodwill, a thrift store, or other pawn shops, comment down below, because I think this actually was pretty interesting to see that some weeks you would go and find stuff and then other weeks you wouldn't at all, and how often they would change stuff around. So I'm pretty interested to see more about this, but enough about that. I've got to go play some video games, so I got to get out of here, so check that video out if you haven't already. But again, I think the best thing that I picked up was probably this, but what do you think? Is that burn mark something that would cause you concern? I tested it and everything's been working, but I'm interested because it's weird. But enough about that. I got to get out of here, so check that video out if you haven't already.